I mean, when you're an FTE in this position, don't you find
Yeah.
yourself on call 24/7, 365?
In fact, the Saturday night event with the 6-inch gas main explosion, I was just about ready to walk into a Beatles tribute concert.
Did you get on call pay?
I think I got a thank you from my boss.
I remember
No.
your gas line thing, man. And when you called me and were wanting to tell me that, hey, you better get your burn unit ready, you better
Yep,
get,
yep.
your trauma, you need your helicopters over here. It's like, dude, I was on a beach in
Yeah.
Florida. I
Yes.
had a little umbrella drink in my hand, and it wasn't my first. I immediately called our administrator on call and explained to her, this is what's happening, and by the way, I'm out. And my wife's looking at me and going, is there anywhere you guys can go to get away from this shit?
Yeah.
And I'm like,
Why is that doggone
no.
Al bothering me?
That's
Yeah,
the nature of our business.
Hi, everybody. This is Chris. Another episode of Readiness Rewired. It's that time, Al. And
It is.
I point to Al and to Mike. You guys want to give a shout out?
Hey guys, this is Al. Welcome.
Hi, it's Mike.
And I think that the topic I'd like to throw out there for discussion is incident command system, or as it's been mildly adapted, moderately adapted, hospital incident command system, and some concerns about it not quite being shaped, molded, and actively inserted, if you will, into the training and the response readiness for healthcare, and specifically through my experiences, what I've seen for hospitals. I'd say the same would be going for most long-term care facilities, and clinics would probably be a fair thing to say. Right, guys?
Absolutely.
And so, yeah, let me just throw out just a very, very general kind of frame of reference, and that is, coming from a 40-plus year in healthcare, I think pre-2000 we saw a lot of focus on disaster response from hospitals in terms of mass casualties. There were building collapses. I think there was a famous one in Kansas City, or infamous one in Kansas City, several plane crashes that ended up being really kind of messy mass casualty scenarios. And so there's a lot of focus for hospitals in preparing for kind of a singular mass casualty kind of concept. Then we had 9/11, and 9/11 was really rattled our country, and we saw a lot of federal money become available, and with that, kind of a rush to, in order to spend that federal money, you had to meet certain thresholds, minimum thresholds, and included in that was incident command and incident command training. And it's remained there. So I have been taken to task for a variety of emergencies since then, where maybe we haven't fully applied it, deployed it, and seen its full benefits, whether that's hurricanes, again, tornadoes, cyber threats, and so on. So, it's out there. It came out of the fire departments in the 1970s that were responding as multiple departments to wildland fires, and they weren't all on the same page in terms of their terminology, in terms of their communications channels, and just the ability to integrate. So I think federally it's always existed as this multi-community or multi-entity integration plan. But for us in healthcare, I'm not sure we've really understood and had that role mature. I think there are some good examples, and hopefully, Mike, you can kind of share that here shortly. But I think it's been a real struggle as people look at something that was really built in the 70s for public safety, which is a quasi-military, designations like sergeant, lieutenant, and so on, infrastructure, and it being put in the lap of private sector like hospitals, and then being asked to be able to use that, and it doesn't necessarily correlate to how they do things day to day. So sudden shift in ability to use that, and I would say Mike would be able to understand this, is it's sort of like disaster triage tags. You're given those, you're told to use them in a disaster. If you've never really practiced with them and there's a disaster, for many, many, many years, even through current times, haven't been an awful lot of situations where they've actually been deployed. And some of that, there's the academic need that's discussed, and then there's the operational practice that people have every day in like incident command or triage, and if it isn't practiced, it doesn't seem to really materialize. So I'll probably bring this up before I kick it over to you guys, but I compare it sort of in a very general sense to football or basketball, team sports, where there's a structure, there's a game plan, there's a playbook, and a need for flexibility, but things are practiced, and I'm not sure that we've really gotten to that point with incident command on a widespread basis. Your thoughts, guys?
Well, I don't disagree. That's absolutely true. The history that you described of incident command and where it came from and whatnot probably points to why, right? How we haven't really fully embraced it, or our leadership haven't fully embraced it across the country, carte blanche. The California EMS folks back in, 70s tried to adapt it from wildfire and public safety response, like you mentioned, to hospitals, which the birth of Hospital Emergency Incident Command System, HICS, was the initial iteration. I get what they were trying to do, like what you said. They were trying to adapt it in some way where hospitals would be able to take the same concepts and apply them, right? But how good of a job that was is debatable. And then getting people to embrace it, well, then the federal government, like you say, comes along with the funding. And I remember how incident command sort of got started at our facility. I wasn't really involved yet. I was still doing other things in the hospital. And I remember there was the pandemic influenza planning committee put together. It was really kind of our initial disaster planning group for the facility, and that arose fortunately at a very high level with the senior associate director of the hospital sort of in charge of it, because they were scared of a pandemic, of some sort of influenza thing. And that was about the early to mid 2000s, I think, when that was born. So that's kind of how it was born, I believe, in our facility, and then it sort of moved from there. But the federal funding was obviously instrumental in trying to get more people to adopt it and bring it into play. And then the regulatory agencies start getting involved later and later. We're talking a lot of years later, where you got Joint Commission, CMS, or whatever, basically saying, look, you guys need to have this, and you need to embrace it, and you need to practice it twice a year, or whatever it is, So I think its evolution hasn't been real cohesive and uniform, like you say. I agree with that. And I think, unfortunately, that's why so many hospitals across the country still struggle with it. They don't have the time and the commitment and the financial backing to be able to do the kinds of things you'd really like to do with it to make people proficient in its use. It's like Al's always said, if the mind is going to go somewhere, the body's got to go there first, right?
Yep, the body can't go where the mind has not been. Absolutely.
There you go. There you got it. Got it right way. Well, and he's absolutely right. If you don't practice it, your analogy to football or other team sports is spot on. If you sit there and at the locker room and draw on a board and tell people how to play football, but you don't go out and practice it, you're not going to be very damn good at it. And so Chris's analogy, I think, is spot on. I think what it boils down to, and you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, it's all about culture. It has to be ingrained into the culture of the facility. And how does that happen? In what ways can it be ingrained into the culture? What do you guys think?
Well, yeah, and I'll jump in because the incident command system and the HICS, starting off HICS, and then they dropped the emergency word in there and just became hospital incident command system. You know, everybody, and it's been for a long time, everybody's been so busy at the hospital, and our executives have been so busy at hospitals that they look at the drill that we want to put on, and hey, we're going to get incident command together. Well, go do your drill in the ED, or go do your drill over here or there. Just don't bother us in some cases. And it's just one more thing that they got to fit onto their calendar, and their calendars are packed. But you're right. It's the mentality that, hey, this is an important piece. And even though it's kind of like car insurance or home insurance or life insurance, you pay for it, but you hope you never have to use it. You know, and incident command and emergency preparedness is that same kind of concept where you hope you never have to use it. But if you do, you're glad you practiced on it, because then you have a little bit of sense of feeling of what am I supposed to do, you know, in incident command.
So guys, I'm gonna jump in here too, because I'm gonna really point a finger at FEMA and the federal folks, because they took something that was an out-of-box concept for multi-agencies at a significant event. Obviously, wildfires, we're hundreds or thousands of acres and lots of folks there over a series of days, and they really built it out. But 99% of the focus is on these really complex, large-scale incidents that are relatively rare, and so they created a complexity guide, right? Or a nomenclature, and they've said, level 1 incidents are those regional, massive, significantly disruptive events are level 1. Level 2 are a little bit smaller, and it goes down to 3, 4, and 5, and 4 and 5 are local. 5 is essentially a level 5 in terms of complexity, is basically within your own walls. But all the material and all the teaching that I've seen put out federally is at that level 1, level 2, where you're dealing with the fire department, and you're dealing with the state folks and so on, and that's difficult to practice with all those people on any kind of regular basis. So there's no material that I've seen that really, if you go back and it translates ICS into a more user-friendly format, right? ICS that the fire department built or put together is a management by objectives system. And, we talk about objectives, but we don't really practice the building of them within incident command. Again, all the emphasis is at this large, very complex level, and like football, you're not going to do a really complex play unless you've got individual players that understand their roles and can play and do iterations at a smaller, more basic level. And so I think incident command, where it's really missing, is having the tools and the support to practice at that intra facility level. And so I think the better practitioners, by virtue of the default of this larger scale focus, are university hospitals. And I think, Mike, you'll have some examples for us where you guys have gotten to be pretty good practitioners. Your tertiary care facility, you're the intersection of other people's disasters. I mean, they hand them off to you. And Al, I think you've worked at facilities that are a little bit smaller, but still pretty significant, are connected to smaller critical access hospitals. So yep. I think what's missing is a tool set that really goes back and revises and translates incident command into and they say it's scalable, but the material just isn't there for people to practice with, and so you force a lot of artificialities in the practice, and that's the first place you're going to lose your administrators. So if you're driven by incident, you're driven by situation. Mike, I think you've run into some circumstances that you've been able to leverage into maybe a really solid incident command infrastructure.
Well, I think you may have nailed it on the head. I think I think the lack of the scalable tool set, like you've talked about, has been a problem. I can remember trying to. It's like shoehorning something into your incident command and your disaster preparedness exercises to fit the tools you've been given. But in reality, you ought to be adjusting the tools to fit the job you're trying to accomplish. And so what I discovered early on is you take this big toolkit they give you, right, with all these forms and all the structure and all that stuff. You throw that in front of your people and they're going, why am I using this? What do I need this for? Why all this? Why all this? Why all that? And I think what happened is that as time progressed and you watch, if you take a close look and watch how people work with the tools that you give them, all the paperwork, for example, and you put those out on the tables, and they have their job action sheets, and they have their 7 pages or 6 pages that are put together and become the incident action plan, and you do all of this stuff and you make them use all that stuff. They get frustrated and they go, this is making it more complex than what I would actually do for real in a real incident. And if you haven't had real incidents, you don't really know, okay, how would I normally do it, and how am I supposed to do it with these tools? And so you're right. As an academic medical center, we do see the trickle-down effect of other people's incidents. And so I think we've had the luxury of the experience of having to do this, but we don't take and embrace that full tool set. We've ended up paring it down, and people end up paring down the expectations or the checklists, if you will, that come on your job action sheets to going to, okay, here's what I really need to focus on. And because I told them after several exercises, I said, well, tell me what you want to do to your job action sheet. If you don't feel that's appropriate, tell me. I'll change it, because I've got we got the electronic versions of these, and then we eventually did put them up as an electronic fillable PDF. I'll change your job action sheet. Let's just change it and make it fit what you're trying to get accomplished. So that's what we ended up doing. And
so Mike, sorry, I just want to jump in. A job action sheet, for those that aren't familiar with incident command, is really a short summary of what your job is in a role assigned with incident command, like an incident manager, or you're a planner, or you're a getter of things, right? And the job action sheet helps to frame what that job is. And so you're saying that you've took sort of a federal template, and you really had people own that and rewrite it so that it not only understood, but it applied to them, and it was usable and practicable.
More usable, right? Yeah,
More
absolutely. And so, did everybody do that for me? Oh, let's be real. No, they didn't. I mean, I had some real gun-hoers that said, oh, yeah, okay, they started lining through their job action sheet and, writing stuff in and all that, and then I'd change it, and then it fit their job better the next time. And that's an evolution of time and process, whether they'll take their time to do it. But, in our incident command structure, when I left, we had 110 positions. The largest template for a hospital of our size provided to us by the kit, the HICS kit, is 78 positions. We modified the whole structure, to fit better what we did and how things were arranged in our facility. Yep. So we moved things that were in the operations section and moved it over under logistics, because the logistics section chief actually monitored and was in charge of those things on a day-to-day basis. So, the way we tried to look at it is like, okay, day-to-day operations are done like this, but when we go into incident command, day-to-day operations are no longer done like that, but to make it a complete flip to opposite of what you normally do, we found just didn't work. So we had to modify it in such a way where it sort of mirrored how things were managed on a day-to-day basis, but there were changes, there were modifications, and people were doing things during incident command activation that they normally don't do, right? And they were over people they weren't normally over. So we tried to maintain some continuity between day-to-day into disaster declaration phase. And I think that's the one thing that people can understand, maybe need to understand, is it's scalable, but you can also change it. They're not so rigid in the requirements in Joint Commission or CMS or whatever that you have to go by this template. It's written in stone. No, it isn't.
So again, to translate, so this is again for those that may not be as familiar, because you mentioned like section chiefs and stuff. The archetypical ICE, and we'll spend another episode perhaps getting more into the actual workable scalability. Right now, we're just talking about the need for it and how maybe it's been adapted. But in the archetypical ICS, you've got some command positions, and then you've got some what they call general staff positions. And so like when you're mentioning section chiefs and stuff, you're using that template from ICS. Internally, changing and shuffling things around is not as important, but I shouldn't say it's not important. It's still at the macro level where you would be interacting with, say, the state, or you would be interacting with our regional partners. You would retain position titles and responsibilities in an interchangeable way to work with those other organizations. But internally, you have much more flexibility to adapt that, because it doesn't matter what you call somebody, not really, if the job falls in a different way, in a different manner, and that's not going to interface with somebody outside, where you have that, again, that problem that FEMA pointed out about common language, common titles, and so on. So at those macro levels, like the incident command and the liaison and the public information officer and the safety officer, and then those 4 general major positions that may interact with external partners, those are essentially the same, but you've adapted and practiced to much more comfortable right sizing within your facility. Is that right?
That's a great way to describe it. The forward-facing appearance of our incident command structure looks like what our county does, what our city does, what our state does, etc. But you're right, when you get down to it and you look at it more at a micro level to make it work within our 4 walls, we've changed it. And I just think people ought to feel more comfortable to do that. And I credit my initial boss for doing this. He was the COO of the hospital, very PhD level guy, really incredible thinker, deep thinker. He sat there and looked at that ICS thing out of FEMA, and he got out of California. He goes, "This isn't going to work in this hospital." He goes, we need to change this. And here, do this, move these people here, do this. Kept the basic structure, but moved things around to make it work better inside our hospital. Let me give you one more example of what he did. And it actually bore out in remember the huge EF5 tornado down in Missouri? Joplin, right?
Joplin?
Yep.
I remember spending a couple days with those folks, months down the road after their incident, and listened to the things that went well, what didn't go so well, and when that hospital was just basically destroyed. They said the same things that my boss said. They said, when they went from HICS to HICS, HICS was Hospital Emergency Incident Command System. Then they wanted it to be more generic, so you didn't have to have an emergency to activate your incident command system. Hospital Incident Command System. They took out a lot of one of the branches that's under operations. They took a lot of individual positions out and melded them and meshed them together in what's called the medical care branch. The medical care branch is really where the meat and potatoes of a hospital are, really, when you come down to taking care of patients. They took a lot of that and combined it and took out a bunch of different individual positions. We left them in because my boss looked at it and said, "We're a hospital. You can't have these positions having all of this responsibility. You have to keep these original structures." So what we did is we kept about 10 or 20 of the original HICS positions that first came out that were combined or meshed under HICS and left them in there. So that's why the ICS we ended up using was 110 positions and not 78. You see what I'm saying? And the
Right.
Joplin people said the same damn thing at their debrief that I attended. They said, "You know what? This doesn't work for us. We had people overwhelmed. We didn't have enough people in these command positions dealing with the catastrophic things we were dealing with." So they flipped back to the original HICS sort of structure, where you had more meat and potatoes in the medical care branch of the incident command structure. Made perfect sense to us. Absolutely.
And a critical access. Well, go ahead, Al. Yeah.
Well, I was going to say, I'll add in there, you're talking about the bigger institutions and entities and hospital systems, and yet when I came in to learn about incident command, I was first in supply chain, and so I was in the logistics portion and fought a little bit of it because it didn't make sense to me, but I wasn't ingrained in it as much as when I got into emergency management. But when I got into emergency management full time and had to take on those responsibilities of helping people understand incident command and helping train, it's like, I appreciated, and I hear what you guys are saying, but I appreciated something on paper to start a reference point with people talking and showing job action sheets and showing all the different forms that they had to fill out. And you're right, we didn't do a great job at doing all of that all the time, but it was at least something I could start with. So when I talked about, in general, incident command, I talk about when I am with people, the general guidelines, the evaluate the issue, that's in there. Determine who's best to assist. And that's where you're starting to build your incident command team and deciding that I'm adding that second, that third, that fifth, that 10th, that 12th person in that team that's responding to the incident, depending on how big it is. It shows us with those job action sheets. And I tell people, don't be nervous if you're in incident command and something happens and they say, I want you to be X, this position. Said, it's not an end all, answer all questions, but get out the job action sheet related to that position and start reading through those, because we've got the immediate response type things, the 0 to 2 hour stuff you need to think about. Now, it's not all inclusive, but it does give them starting that brain power to think about things they need to think about for that incident they're dealing with and what their responsibilities are. So I looked at it, because I'm a non-clinical person. I came into it and said, wow, this is better than a blank sheet of paper, which I've come into other positions for. And now, as Mike said, and we adjusted a few positions as well, not on the same level as a larger institution like Mike, but we did do some things to adjust it and make it feel like it fit a little better with the positioning of what we were doing. But that incident command, they always talk about, well, gosh, when do I activate it? And I said, well, it's to open or not open. What do you do? Well, you can open it anytime you're overwhelmed from a staff, a space, or a stuff standpoint. And it's another tool. And I think, all in all, a pretty good tool to get started with, and then modify from there. When we've done incident command, we set up our operations group, we set up our planning group, we set up our logistics group. The thing we've come short on a lot of times was getting those finance people involved until COVID hit. And like anybody, they know, with a federal incident, if you don't document it, you didn't do it. Well, the finance people have to be in there documenting and getting the money. If the hospitals want to get paid for the services they do above and beyond their normal daily hospital work with this event, COVID being the one, then the finance people played a big role. And that's where, I talk about with COVID, until that time when I was in emergency preparedness, like you guys, I had a difficult time convincing people to take the time to go through an exercise and set up incident command. Like I said earlier, let the ED deal with the medical surge. Let this department deal with this particular catastrophe. But incident command was like, we'll handle it later. Well, when COVID came along, all of a sudden, and I had great support from our executive team on that, they said, hey, we need to get a lot more people understanding a lot deeper issues in incident command of why it's there, how it's there. And again, I talk about those battlefield decisions that they're making. The decision that they made at 10:05 might be changing 15 minutes or 30 minutes or a half a day later. That's okay. In incident command, helps the teams do that because they have their briefings and they have all the other things. So I kind of look at it, it's a good guide, to give a person something to start with, and then do all the adjustments.
Yeah, and I think Mike really hit a key transition point in terms of adopting and using it, and that is going from HICS to HICS is think less of it as, and of course the minute you pull the disaster word out to leadership, that seems to imply a loss of control, and they just don't want to go there. So there's a reluctance to maybe consider it and to push that button. Using it for disruptions. Especially unplanned disruptions, right? Events are planned things, incidents are unplanned things. So if you start looking at incidents, and especially if they impact more than one department, one organizational unit within your hospital, then think, well, maybe there's some application of incident command principles. So if we step back from the kind of the sport game or it's football game, we have players and here's their titles. What are the things we need to get done, and who has the background, and where can we have just-in-time training? So we again, it's built on wildland fires, which is kind of, it could occur in a variety of situations, but it's kind of the same beast, different iteration. For hospitals, you can have COVID, which is literally months, years, and then you can have mass casualty events or active shooter situation within your facility where it ramps up very, very fast. So issues of cadence and communication, I like to use, how big, how bad, and how fast. The incident is going to help determine the cadence, and also what time of day. You can build and practice ICS with everybody during the day, but where and how's that going to translate at night, on weekends, when people are on vacation, when you have a number of people that have left to go to a conference for your facility. So there's elements of flexibility, fluency, just basic understanding. So I go back to ICS. Don't look at the fire version of it as forcing yourself into those roles, but what are the principles that it's built on? It's goals, objectives, strategies, tactics, and tasks. Those are different levels. And incident command, as it's started to evolve for hospitals, and my understanding is now, having gone through the major portion of the pandemic, it's under revision too, so it'll be interesting to see what we have. One of the positions they're talking about is, an incident command facilitator, somebody that doesn't do anything except manage the concepts, principles, and practices. And maybe that's something we can practice with, just like a coach in football, where we've got somebody that isn't jumping into the specific problem that's being solved, but the format. Again, cadence. If you're going to do a briefing, is it really brief, and is it on task? Or are you going from objectives and strategies, which is incident command, into a specific tactic or task, which is really for your general staff? So really understanding the principles of incident command, and then looking at scalability. In a hospital, a cardiac arrest response team or response from a maybe a non-clinical area is a good example of a scaled down disruption that is calling for those sorts of concepts, and to a certain degree those roles of, you have an overall organizer or leader, you've got somebody watching out for safety of everybody, and so on. So looking for different ways that you can practice the concepts within your organization beyond just waiting for the big one will create those habits, and as they say, during those significant disruptions, we don't rise to the occasion, we sink to the level of our habits and our practice. practices. And if we haven't practiced those principles, we're really fighting two monsters. One the unfamiliarity of incident command, and then also trying to deal with the disaster. So are you using incident command, and the use of it, is it in spite of, or because of what you're trying to do? And I think we haven't gotten over that. Not for most hospitals, or in maybe incomplete ways. So again, kind of circling back to Mike, how did you get buy-in at a large facility, and how have you practiced and adapted? You kind of talked about position sheets, job action sheets, but how did you get? It sounded like a leader, a thoughtful leader that really looked at and understood not just the piece of paper, but the stuff behind it. How did it get really owned? And I know, Al, you've also seen that and spoken of it in a facility or facilities where people really understood that. So I'd like you guys to speak a little bit about how it really got adopted and integrated.
I don't know if it was just my dumb luck or what, but being inherited by a leader who was my immediate supervisor, who happened to be in the C-suite, I think that was the key. It really was. Because as soon as somebody in that level makes a decision, it seems like everybody's going to follow suit, right? So, I was under the COO of the hospital. And so the COO says, all right, we need to have an exercise this spring. Pick a date. I'm going to check with the CEO's schedule, and we'll make sure that he or she is available. Great. Well, what about that CEO? Are they really going to be bought into this? Well, I remember when I first took this position, and we were in an interim CEO situation during a level 1 response in this part of our state, and we got done with that, and then a new CEO was hired from a neighboring state, a large metropolitan area, and he comes in and says, I'm supposed to meet with you, and you're supposed to teach me about this HICS thing. What is that all about? I'm sort of familiar with it where I came from, but I didn't really have a lot to do with it. I'm like, well, you're going to be the incident commander. What? He's the new CEO goes, incident commander, what's that all about? So I was actually charged with sitting down with the new CEO and explaining to him what the culture was that had been established before he got here. And I remember spending a few hours with him, and it's like, okay, I could tell he was like, okay. I'm not so sure about this. I could tell he wasn't bought into it. He wasn't. The COO was bought into it, but the new CEO was like, I didn't have to do this in my other facility. So it took a couple of situations to actually convince him. One I remember very vividly. It wasn't really a disaster declaration. It wasn't really a need for HICS per se for a response, but it was a potential threat and a major shutdown of a major utility that could have caused other problems. It was a steam pipe, one of those really big, high-pressure steam pipes that was in the lower level of one of our patient care pavilions, and it was starting to leak. And we were being told by the engineers that, there is a small chance this sucker could blow. And if it blows, I don't know how many PSI this thing was, but it was a high-pressure, large-capacity steam pipe, and it just happened to be sitting right next to a gas line. And it just happened to be sitting within a few feet of some major electrical stuff, like a huge cabinet that actually was a transfer switch to our backup emergency power, which probably housed at least 140 beds, plus our cath lab and some other things. And so when he was faced with this, with his engineering people, with our house engineering people, he immediately thought to himself, geez, I need to make a decision. Do we take action now? Do we try to just patch it? Do we try to repair it? It's like right after Thanksgiving. It's wintertime. We'd have to dig up the front entrance of the hospital, excavation, do all this kind of crap. To make that decision, he decided to call HICS, an instant activation of the incident command structure. I said, cool. So let's bring him in. So brought him in. The engineers went over the situation, described the potentials. Everybody in all the sections, Chris mentioned the sections, each section got to sit and mull it over, and then the section chief, the head of each section, then reported out during a briefing of what they thought about the situation and the potential threats and whatever. And obviously the biggest focus was on the medical care branch of how this could potentially, affect medical care. Would we have to evacuate those people out of that pavilion if, something catastrophic happened? And, we have these lateral, evacuation plans for moving people into other parts of the facility versus external, and doing all of that kind of stuff. And after listening to everybody's input, the CEO finally came to the conclusion of what he was going to do, and he ordered it. And from that day forward, it just seemed like suddenly he had a better or a different attitude towards it. And then all of a sudden, he's wanting to be more involved. And, he was actually teaching a master's in healthcare administration, MHA course, capstone course every spring. Suddenly I'm invited to come spend 2 days with these, future executives. He says, these people need to learn about HICS. Went right out of school before they ever have their first job as an executive in a healthcare institution. So then suddenly it's being embraced, right? So it seems like you need a trigger. You need an event. You need something to make the leadership buy into the value of the system. And that
never waste a
seems
good
to how it
disaster.
evolved.
Right, Mike?
Right.
Never waste a good disaster.
Well, that's the truth. I mean, and unfortunately, we've seen our share here in this state, in this part of our state. And so if you've actually had to really actually activate it, like Al talks about with COVID, then people seem to start understanding, boy, I'm going to buy into this because this is legit. You actually use it. But I think the other key thing here is, like you maybe experienced in COVID, and we certainly did too, it has to evolve and change over time as well. That rigid FEMA structure that Chris talks about.
Yep.
You can't view that thing as written in stone. It's like Moses is not coming down from Mount Horeb or whatever with these tablets and saying, you got to stick with this shit, otherwise you're in big trouble. You're going to go, you're going to go to hell if you actually mess up and not use this form, or start changing this and looking at the structure. You got to have a different attitude about it. It's like, I got to make this fit. The shoes got to fit your facility.
But you still have to adhere to the principles and practices.
Sure.
Right? And we've only identified a few of them. Again, at a later time we can talk more about, limiting the number of people that report to leaders during a time of stress and distress and so on.
Bet.
And again, the importance of communication. So understanding it, and then I think really you're saying a key influencer. Identify a key influencer, set them up with the ingredients, and then make sure that as they take off and support it, make sure someone like you is there to really coach them in the process, and not just, hey, it's like a pickup game of football, you need the coach. Right?
You're right. You're absolutely right. Basically, my job, when we activate HICS, which I didn't have the authority to do that, I could recommend a standby. That was all the authority I was given. I could actually work with another member of our emergency management subcommittee, and if the two of us, we had a leadership team, if the two of us decided we need to put the system on standby because we're watching something that's starting to develop and starting to get scary, we could actually put it on what we call a standby, level 1 standby. But to actually activate it is out of my authority. But then once we're activated, I'm the command center manager. So I'm the manager of the hospital command center. I stand up there at the podium, make all the pieces work, all the mics, all the forms, everybody's got it, and everybody's got positions. We had to have, 3 deep in every position, make sure all the positions are filled, get it all up and running, and making sure people are doing and getting things off on the right foot. Now, so I think having a management type of person to get the ball rolling and making sure HICS is activated and it's supposed to be working like it's supposed to is a great one. The problem is, then they also made me an external liaison. So part of our system was we had 3 liaison officers. We had the liaison officer that sat in the command center and was responsible for all the major communications. But then 2 of us were sent away, and if it was a large enough incident where the county, let's say, activated the EOC. If the EOC, the Emergency Operations Center at County EMA, is activated, I was sent there. So I'd go sit there, and then in our university and our city has a command post, another liaison was sent there. to talk to the mothership of the university and the city fathers and people. So then those two liaison officers were reporting back to the central main liaison officer, who was an executive level person sitting in the command post. So, to make sure there's that great communication upward and downward in the chain. So, it's a great plan, but then sometimes things don't carry through.
But again, you're adhering to the principles.
Right.
You're
Yeah,
adhering to the principles
absolutely.
in your practice.
Right.
Yeah.
It's a guide. And I want to give a couple examples as well, because when I was still in supply chain and more on the logistics side of incident command, the person who was running the exercises in my position part-time, or handling, he had several hats he was wearing. I remember at that time, one of the campus presidents came up, and his name was, the person who was running the exercise was Dave, and the president came up and said, "Dave, when's this thing going to be open, or what going to be over? It's costing me money." He was just frustrated because he didn't see the value in it. Now that has changed. The culture has changed. By the time I was in emergency management and emergency preparedness, the CEO was very much supportive of what was going on, and I never heard statements like that. But I was always asked, well, Al, you have exercises here and there in the morning, in the afternoon, in the evenings, things like that, but we don't ever practice with incident command on second shift or third shift or weekends. And I explained to him, I said, well, this is the command team that will be called in if things happen. And they were kind of hesitant. And two incidents happened. One was on a Friday night. We had a fire in an electrical panel at one of our smaller hospitals, and it was midnight. Well, incident command came in. We set up incident command at another hospital to accept the patients. We were told it was going to be 48 hours before things got going. Well, the incident command team responded and reacted well, because the administrator on call and the house supervisor activated all that, and then the team came in. The other one I remember was a Saturday night. And Saturday, it's a weekend. We had an incident happen at a factory where a 6-inch gas main exploded, blew walls out. It's a good thing more people weren't on
I
site.
remember that one.
Yes,
I remember
yeah.
you.
Yes, well, I called you, Mike, because we had air ambulances coming in. It was crazy. And this is a critical access hospital area. We had more nurses respond in the incident command team on a Saturday night. I didn't know we had that many nurses at the critical access hospital. They came out of the woodwork to respond, because we had all talked about it and trained on it on days and done all the things, and it worked. And so everybody said, wow, I guess we understand a little bit more about incident command versus an exercise in the ED or an exercise up in med surg or med tele or anything like that of a tornado or a fire or whatever the case may be. But it was really good to see them seeing everything come together and see how it all fits and flows, and that they could come in, put a cohesive group together. And even though they hadn't dealt with this particular issue before, the guide that they had from HICS, from Hospital Incident Command System, was enough to get them going. The other thing I want to say is we also learned, and I proved to everybody, said, it's a process, not a place. Don't think of your incident command as, it's in the executive boardroom and it's always there. Well, maybe so, but what if that is the place that has the incident you got to set up differently? In both those incidents I talked about, we set up alternate incident command sites, and they worked wonderfully, because we weren't so locked into one particular place that it threw us off. We had already talked about the body can't go where the mind has not been. We've already talked about and said what happens if this and that happens. Now, I will say Mike, because Mike and I were doing a lot of work together, he invited me out to one of his exercises with Ebola. It's one of the first ones I went out. And I looked at our incident command team, and we'd get 6, 8, 10 people in there, and it was really cool. I walked into his facility, and I looked and went, there's got to be 100 people in here. He said, yep, that's it. I saw the incident command, expanded to that degree because of the level of exercise they were doing. And it was eye-opening to me to be able to say, in a smaller scale, we're doing okay. Here's what it looks like in different things. So for the critical access hospitals, I go back and help them and say, look, yeah, it might only be 3 or 4 of you because we don't have a ton of people at a critical access hospital, but that's okay. It's scalable, and we can adapt and adjust and then call in partners and call in other resources as we need them, which again is the guide for what HICS is trying to help us do.
You brought up a good point. I don't want to get off topic, but did you guys ever find out that you were never not on call? I mean, when you're an FTE in this position, don't you find yourself on call 24/7, 365?
In fact, the Saturday night event with the 6-inch gas main explosion, I was just about ready to walk into a Beatles tribute concert and that night went up in smoke. I mean, I left everybody. I had to take my car and go down to the hospital and coordinate things. It's okay. I mean, I knew what I was getting into, but you're right. The midnight call on a Friday night, I was at the hospital where the electrical panel explosion happened until Saturday at noon, and I was up from Friday morning.
There you go.
It wasn't that many years ago.
Did you get on-call pay?
I think I got a thank you from my boss.
Oh, yeah, exactly. I don't think any of us got on-call pay. I remember your gas line thing, man, and when you called me and were wanting to tell me that, hey, you better get your burn unit ready, you better get, your trauma, you need your helicopters over here. It's like, dude, I was on a beach in Florida. I had a little umbrella drink in my hand, and it wasn't my first. And I'm listening to this going, what? And I knew immediately, it's like, okay, I know I get these calls, but I immediately called our administrator on call and explained to her, this is what's happening, and by the way, I'm out. I'm not going to be of any help in this situation. And it's like, God, and my wife's looking at me and going, is there anywhere you guys can go to get away from this shit? Yeah. And I'm like,
why is that doggone Al bothering me?
It's the nature of our business, man. It's our nature.
I knew who a resource was Mike, and I knew you would have the contacts quicker than I would ever be able to get them, and it worked. And that's the partnership and the cooperation and that we all do, and that's kind of why it's like, yeah, I'm on call, but you know what? I got a call this morning. I mean, I'm retired now. I got a call this morning from some incident at the hospital. Hey, Al, I want you to be aware of this. I got the notice on my phone because I still get the notices, and they said, well, if it gets going, we're going to call you in. All right, whatever. I mean, I'm there to help.
That's in part. That's what makes this. It's both like quicksand and also this consummate area of interest. Is it's so complex. There's so many different rabbit holes and directions you can go to explore and understand emergency management, or try to understand it. And as Al mentioned, it's a process, and incident command system and hospital incident command system is really built to help manage the process and to manage it in those unsettled circumstances where there's a lot going on, and the assumptions we work with every day that we've got power, we've got light, we've got adequate supplies, we've got adequate people are impacted. And so now you've got to work with this kind of complex dynamic. Incident command is set up to expand and tackle that. Again, though, I think that historically we haven't really gotten the tools and the blueprints out to really work with it, understand it, and practice it. And I think in stepping back and looking at what we've talked about, what would be your recommendations to people that are looking at incident command and they don't seem to have enough time, they don't have access to the tools, maybe they don't have a really, really good working understanding of incident command. And again, those that are former firefighters or law enforcement officers may have different versions or understandings of incident command. So for their situation, what would be our recommendations? Key parts or next steps?
Well, I think one of the things I do and try to keep it relatively simple because of valuing people's time, I think there are some good study courses out there now. If you take them online, they are very painful. They are very long. But I've condensed them down, and not a FEMA certificate, but the state has allowed me to do the trainings for, IS, which is individual study, IS 700, the National Incident Management System, to just understand the basics, to get the basic concepts down. And then I follow that up with IS 100, which is Introduction to Incident Command System, and then follow that up with IS 200, ICS for Single Resource and Initial Action Action Incidents. Those three I really condense down, but I give them a flair of, hey, here's how this all fits together, and here's what this thing at the hospital is. I will also mention there's one other thing, and Mike, I don't know, we can talk about it offline, if we could ever put the link in our podcast or somehow, I show the people the video of the hospital incident command system being explained to doctors, and it's through the
I use the
HICS
same one.
Yes,
Yep.
and I think that is so good because it goes through and explains a little more, Chris, like what you're talking about. It explains the positions and all the responsibilities and things, but it is so good. I have people watch that, and it's maybe, I don't know, 13, 15 minutes. It's not that big a deal. And
Yeah, good
for
thought.
that, I give them a, just a basics of, hey, you don't have to understand everything right away, but just understand the concepts and the basics so we can get going. And then I get into job action sheets and all the other stuff. But
I gave that video for the MHA students that we worked with as their homework or pre-study before I went and spent a couple of sessions with them. So yeah, you got a great video there.
I just want to add a caveat that the video, any single tool, doesn't knock it out of the park. Again, this is a comprehensive understanding, but you're getting people pried away from the two-dimensional look at this chart, organizational chart, into a more understandable working knowledge of incident command, right? With the video.
Yep.
Video helps with that. Helps with that.
Absolutely.
Mike, what about you?
I don't
Anything
know. Jeez, man, it's tough. I think that's the problem with, I think, how our profession has evolved. A lot of us, all of us, I don't know how many of us have just been thrown into this with no preparation. I remember looking at the chair in my department going, you want me to do what? What the hell is that? He goes, yeah, you'll figure it out. That's not ideal, right? So, this is a topic for another podcast down the road, is that, if there was some sort of basic rudimentary training that somebody could go through as they start to get into this sort of role would be useful. It's not an end all, but at least it gives you an introduction to it in a more formal fashion, hopefully condensed down to what you need to know as a healthcare facility, okay? And then, having experienced guys. Why are we doing this frickin' podcast? It was Chris's idea. A really good idea, because here you got three guys with some experience. At least maybe, once people get to dip their toe in this and start getting into it, maybe listening to us a little bit might be helpful. And that's really the reason why we're taking time, is working with somebody with experience. You need a mentor. I'm a ham radio operator too. I'm an Elmer to people like you who maybe are looking to get your ham radio license and then get up and running and talking on ham radio. You need an Elmer in the emergency management world to get you going, I think, and finding that Elmer that you can go to is kind of a key element.
Chris and I have our licenses because of Mike. Yeah. And I'm never going to understand all of what Mike does on ham radio, but it's pretty cool. And now when I talk to the ham radio people in our area and talk about for helping an incident command or an event or something, I at least have a concept of what they're going through, which is really good.
Or what they can do for you.
Yes,
right?
what they can do. Right, exactly.
Redundant communications capability for your healthcare institution. What all about, man?
So one of the things that you're touching on too that goes to capability and fluency in incident command is just where a person's at in terms of their acquisition of knowledge and competency in this, right? You have the novice that really doesn't really maybe understand and doesn't know how to apply it, an advanced beginner. You can have people that are proficient, that are competent, that are expert. So it's another thing to continue to consider in the dynamics of incident command is you may have somebody that is your incident commander most of the time, that is very fluent and capable, and doesn't want things written down or doesn't need them written down because they can just do this. And then you're going to have that person, maybe it's a house manager, maybe it's going to be a new junior executive that's going to take call and something's going to happen off shift. That person is going to need more stuff, whether that's job action sheets, whether that's checklists to start up incident command, or even to know where the thresholds are to look at standby, partial activation, or full activation mode. So, yeah, there's lots of moving parts, and I don't think just taking one course, Al mentioned the conventional 100, 200, and the 700 and 800 courses that are put out by FEMA and the Emergency Management Institute. But those are only starting points.
Yep.
It's like people coaching a dynamic process, like even a sport. You've got to put in time and got to put in practice, and you got to have connections. So you guys are speaking to all of those elements. The one, I'm going to kind of take it down to a micro level, but I think it's a really important one because after action reports in almost all disasters where incident command has been used point to communication as being a weakness. And what I find so ironic is that, for decades, people have talked about disasters and setting up incident command and communication still been a problem in the vast majority of them. Why we haven't taken, and this is maybe a test to see whether you're really understanding the principles of the whole thing, but there's a command position called PIO, Public Information Officer. If you really read that title and look at that, that's not really public as in externals. It's also your information officer internal. And now with IT, the advent of information technology and all the different methods in which we communicate, I look for that to be an area that we really need to develop more solidly so that we can work on the cadence and content of communication inside our institutions. Staff that aren't directly involved in the response need to know what's going on. Their families are going to want to know how they're being impacted, their loved ones are being impacted that are working at those facilities, and how we provide updates. We did, I think, we had our eyes open during COVID and talking to other healthcare facilities and trying to figure that out. And I think in things that move at a faster tempo, like the explosions that you guys mentioned, other things that accelerate very rapidly within an organization, how to work the principles of incident command more rapidly, but still honestly and completely with the communication, both internally and externally, areas that could really see a lot of growth and development. So I look forward to more conversations on this. We need to wrap this one up because we've gone slightly in excess of an hour, but I really appreciate your guys' insights. I've learned a lot from that. If people are interested, have comments, again, a reminder to them, they need to consider subscribing to the podcast. They can also reach out to us on our Gmail. That's readiness.rewired@gmail.com to provide some input. And if they want further conversations or suggestions on how we can share things on the podcast, they can do that. Any other final comments, guys?
Not at all. Smash that subscribe button. Ring that bell so you know when we post another video. And give us that thumbs up like. We want to know if this is at all useful to y'all. We're retired. We want to have a purpose in life. That's why we're doing this. We want to make sure we're helping.